The Bonsucro EU-RED Standard has been developed by Bonsucro in response to European legislation, more in particular to legislation in the area of renewable energy. So the EU has laid down targets for the use of renewable energy in its member states, and in those targets, it's also been specified that energy derived from biofuels, bioliquids, and biomass fuels can only be counted as renewable, can only classify as renewable if the fuels meet certain sustainability requirements. Well, these sustainability requirements have been detailed in a piece of legislation which is called the EU Renewable Energy Directive, or RED. So that's where the name Bonsucro EU-RED Standard comes from. And the EU has also specified in that EU Renewable Energy Directive that market operators, companies in the market working in the field of these fuels, that they can use so-called approved voluntary schemes, recognized voluntary schemes, certification schemes to show that they comply with the sustainability requirements in the RED. Well, there is Bonsucro EU-RED is one of the approved voluntary schemes. Yes, on this slide, there is a bit of history on the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. The Bonsucro EU-RED Standard has had a long history. To be honest, we are in 2025 now, and the development of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard has gone hand in hand in the past with the development of the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe. The first Renewable Energy Directive in Europe was published in 2009, and in response to the publication of that directive, the Bonsucro decided to include the sustainability requirements from the EU-RED in its production standard and in its CHOC standard. Then in 2018, the EU published a new version of the RED, the so-called RED 2. Bonsucro then decided to no longer include the requirements from the EU-RED in its production standard and in its CHOC standard, but instead to develop a separate Bonsucro EU-RED standard. That was version 1.1. In 2022, the European Commission came up with an additional piece of legislation, the Implementing Regulation 2022/996, which included additional sustainability requirements on top of the EU-RED 2, which had been published in 2018. Bonsucro then again had to include these additional requirements and published version 2.1 of the standard. Well, and more recently, in 2023, the EU published the third version of the Renewable Energy Directive, number 3, RED 3, and the additional requirements in that directive have been taken into account in the version of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, version 3.0, which we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. So the objective of the webinar today is to present an overview of the changes in the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, version 3, as compared with the previous version, 2.1, of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. And those changes are two types of changes. Most changes directly follow from this new piece of European legislation, so the RED 3, basically. And then there is also some changes in the standard, which I will highlight today, which are not necessarily because of these RED requirements, but which are changes, rather, let's say, additional clarifications in the standards made by the Bonsucro Secretariat in response to, let's say, questions on the standard that were made by operators previously. So to make the requirements in the standard a bit clearer to users. Next slide, please. So today in the webinar, we're going through all these subjects listed on the slides. So different types of changes to different pieces of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, changes relevant for different actors, for mills, for the supply chain, etc. And it's good to note here once again, today we have 1 hour. We're going to focus on the key changes in version 3 of the standard, which means that not all details of all changes can be discussed today. And some changes I will go through rather quickly. So if you want to get a full picture of all the changes, really you need to check the standard version 3.0 in detail as a reference. Next slide, please. Then, to start with, the scope of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. Well, the good news here is that the scope of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard has not changed going from version 2.1 to version 3.0. The standard covers the cultivation and the processing of sugarcane to produce different types of fuels for use in the EU. And then there is various methods, various chains through which it can be achieved, which are listed here as 1 to 4. Also, still agricultural residues from sugarcane cultivation are not in the scope of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. And also processing waste and processing residues are not in the scope of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, with the exception of bagasse, which is included in the scope. In other words, production of biomass fuels from bagasse or second generation ethanol from bagasse is included in the scope of this standard. And I'll come back specifically to the bagasse requirements a bit later. Then the second thing to mention here is that there is some changes in the terminology in the standard. And these changes in terminology basically come from the fact that the European Commission wants voluntary schemes such as Bonsucro to use specific terms in their scheme documentation. Those of you who have read the version 2.1 of the standard will know that in that standard you found the term RED recast, RED recast. That term, RED recast, has now been replaced in version 3 of the standard by the term Revised Directive EU 2018-2001. And this is because the term RED recast, and again, this is not a term which Bonsucro invented, but it's a term used by the European Commission. The term RED recast refers to RED 2, and the term Revised Directive EU 2018-2001 refers to RED 3, and that's why the latter term is now used in version 3 of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, since that standard, as I said, allows compliance with the RED 3 requirements. So this then to clarify a little bit more about this European legislative documentation, one would expect that the RED 3, so the third version of the Renewable Energy Directive, that would be one new piece of legislation which would replace the RED 2 piece of legislation. Well, this is not the case. It's a bit more complicated than that. So there is basically 3 legislative documents in Europe which together contain all the RED requirements. They are listed here. The first bullet is what is being called the RED 2, so the second version of the directive. Then, on top of that, there is the document which is called the Implementing Regulation 2020/1996, which contains additional requirements to RED 2. And then there is the third document, which is this document 2023-2413, which contains again additional requirements on top of the other 2 documents mentioned in the first 2 bullets. So in other words, those of you who are interested in reading the original European Commission legislative documents containing all the RED requirements have to read those 3 documents in conjunction. The good news, however, is that all the requirements from these 3 pieces of legislation which are relevant to sugarcane have been included in the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard version 3. So that's your main reference document if you want to comply with EU-RED requirements. That's the Bonsucro EU-RED Bonsucro EU-RED Standard version 3.0. Next one, please. So we're then moving to some specific changes. And the first category is the changes in version 3 in the requirements that apply specifically for mills. There is, as you can see on this slide, there is changes to 3 indicators that are specifically for mills, indicator EU 1.1, 2.1, and 2.5. I'll take you through those 3 now. Next slide, please. Well, I have to say for the first one, the greenhouse gas criterion, I will pause that for a bit until later this webinar when I speak specifically about the changes in the greenhouse gas requirements, since those changes do not only apply to mills, but do also apply to other supply chain operators. The second change in the indicators that apply specifically to mills is a change in indicator EU 2.1. That indicator already existed in the previous version of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard, but at that time that indicator related only to primary forest and to other wooded land. In the new version of the standard, old growth forest has been added to this indicator, meaning that also old growth forest after January 2008 cannot be converted to sugarcane plantings. So you see in red here on this slide, the change has been made. So there is the addition of old growth forest in the indicator itself, and also then in the second part of the text, you'll find that old growth forests, for a definition of old growth forest, one shall refer to the definition which applies in the country where the forest is located. So that's the addition to indicator 2.1. A new indicator specifically applicable to mills is indicator EU 2.5, which is about heathland. So basically this indicator says that in addition to other types of land which cannot be converted to sugarcane, also heathland after January 2008 cannot be converted to sugarcane. And then again, a definition of heathland is also provided. It says, well, you should use to determine whether a piece of land is heathland, the definition applicable in the country where the heathland is located shall be used. And if there is no official national definition in such a country, then the definition listed here on the slide shall be used. So those were the 3 changes in indicators specifically for mills. Then there is a couple of changes in the requirements for the supply chain. First of all, here in this list of indicators on mass balance requirements, there is 2 not even changes, but 2 clarifications, 2 further clarifications in 2 indicators. Indicator 5.3 on record keeping and reporting to the European Commission, and 1 on defining the unit of certification. I'll take you through both of them. Next slide, please. So indicator 5.3 is about record keeping and reporting to the European Commission. And in particular, this indicator is about the Union database for biofuels. That indicator, by the way, is not new. It was already in the previous version of the standard. And you probably know at this stage, the UDB is a traceability tool created by the European Commission. It is accessible for registered economic operators. However, it's not yet a requirement to enter data in the Union database. At this moment in time, it's still a bit uncertain when exactly this will become a requirement. However, Bonsucro will inform operators and certification bodies on any status updates on these requirements that come out from the European Commission. This is all not new. What has been changed in this indicator is that it has been specified. The requirement has been specified a little bit further, has been made a bit more specific. If you can see here the black text, which was the indicator before, and then in the red text, it's the new formulation of the indicator. It's not a fundamental change. However, it's a much more precise way of defining what the requirement is. Then the other change in relation to mass balance rules is on the unit of certification, although I have to say, again, it's not really a change, but rather a clarification. As you're probably aware, under Bonsucro EU-RED, there's two options for the unit of certification. It's a single unit or it's multi-site. Next slide. And for multi-site, what we have done, what Bonsucro have done, is that we have clarified a bit further when multi-site certification is allowed and when it is not allowed. And you can find the changes in that requirement in red again in this text. So it's clarified here that mass balance physical volume shall not be transferred between sites which are part of a multi-site certificate. And then also it's clarified here that any operator, any unit, any site which involves processing in any form, so distilleries, refineries, bioethanol plants, etc., they cannot be part of a multi-site certificate. Only sites which include only storage, holding, port storage, units, trading offices, etc., can fall under a multi-site certificate. Next slide, please. So then there is, of course, a second set of indicators related to supply chain operators, which is about validating and reconciling Bonsucro EU-RED data. The good news here also is that there is no changes really to the indicators. There's just one further clarification made in relation to indicator 6.11 on specific rules for co-processing. And that clarification reads as it is spelled out here. It defines co-processing. Co-processing refers to a processing unit which processes biomass feedstocks together with fossil feedstocks and transforms them into final fuel. Well, the European Commission has adopted and published a delegated regulation mentioned here, which specifies the mass balance rules, the greenhouse gas calculation rules, which shall be applied in a case of co-processing of biomass together with fossil feedstock. Currently, Bonsucro has not yet included the rules on co-processing in this Bonsucro EU-RED standard, as it was felt to date that it wasn't particularly relevant for sugarcane or ethanol, sugarcane to ethanol chains and processes. So it's not yet included. If you think they should be included, because you need it in your practical operations, you need to calculate with these rules, then I recommend you to reach out to the Bonsucro Secretariat, and then they may consider to include this in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. So that was so the rules for the changes in the requirements for mills, the changes in the requirements for the supply chain, and then of course there is also some changes in the greenhouse gas calculation requirements, which apply to mills and or the supply chain. And the good news here also is that the overall greenhouse gas calculation methodology in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard has not changed. So the overall methodology is still intact and the same, and the way it works with default values, disaggregated default values, or actual values, that whole methodology is intact. However, there are some changes related to minimum greenhouse gas emission saving, CO2 intensity, and then a number of specific field emissions and emission saving factors. And I'll take you through them one by one. The first thing is on the minimum greenhouse gas emissions savings. As you're well aware, a key aspect of the EU-RED sustainability requirements is that a minimum greenhouse gas emission reduction shall be achieved by biofuels, bioliquids, and biomass fuels compared to their fossil fuel alternatives. For those minimum levels of greenhouse gas savings, certain percentages have been specified in the Renewable Energy Directive and therefore also in the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard version 3.0. And those percentages depend on the type of fuel, they depend on the application of the fuel, and they depend on the date on which the facility, the plant which produces the fuels, has come into operation. What you see here, point A to C, is the requirements in relation to biofuels and biogas for the transport sector and bioliquids. And you'll see here that the requirements of 50, 60, and 65% and the dates that apply, that they have not changed. Where the change is, and this is on the next slide, is in relation to biomass fuels, which are used for electricity, heating, and cooling. So in the case of sugar cane chains, that would particularly relate to bagasse briquettes, for examples, which are used for electricity, heating, and cooling production in the EU. So you see here the old requirements, and then you see the new requirements, which are pretty detailed. So I'm not going through them now. I'm not going to read them out loud. But for those of you who are interested in this, I really recommend you to spell it out carefully when reading the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. Next slide, please. Yeah, then a second change, you might say a minor change, but still an important change in this is in relation to greenhouse gas calculations, is about the CO2 intensity. Those of you who work with actual greenhouse gas calculations, they know that you will know that if you do greenhouse gas calculations, you will have to convert emissions of N2O and emissions of methane or CH4 to CO2 equivalent to make it one, to get it in one unit. So these conversion factors, so this called greenhouse gas intensities of N2O and CH4, have been changed in the new version of the standard and be brought in line with the latest insights of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. So here you see the new factors. Next slide. The third change in relation to the greenhouse gas emissions calculations is a very detailed one. I'm not going to spell it out here, but it is in relation to field emissions, so changes of emissions that occur when nitrogen fertilizers have been applied on the land. It's a very specific one. It's important to take note of this change if you work with actual calculations for cultivation of sugarcane. And you find them in section 3.5 and 4.5 of the Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. Then another change in that Annex 1, which is about the greenhouse gas calculation, is in relation to emission savings from improved agricultural management. It's not really a change again, but it's a clarification, which you find in red here in the text. Basically a clarification which is meant to explain better what kind of practices can be applied to ensure emission savings from improved agricultural management. So it's a further explanation of what operators can do if they wish to achieve emission savings through improved agricultural management. And then the last one of this set of changes and requirements related to greenhouse gases is on carbon capture and replacement. And this is a new one in the calculation. previously this was not included in the greenhouse gas calculation methodology included in the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard. This is about emission savings from carbon capture and replacement. And carbon capture and replacement is when in a process, CO2, which is released by the process, is being captured and being used by another processing facility, a chemical facility or another facility, to replace fossil CO2. Yes, and in that case, the CO2, which is not emitted from a processing unit, but is instead captured and is reused somewhere else to replace fossil CO2. And that's an emission saving, a CO2 emission saving, and that can be taken into account then in the overall actual greenhouse gas calculation. It's a specific calculation, so if this is applicable to, potentially applicable to your company, then I recommend to read section 3.10 and 4.10 of Annex 1 of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard in detail. Next slide. So a number of changes I highlighted in the previous slides in relation to greenhouse gas emission calculation, and you may then question yourself, okay, what are the consequences of these changes for the Bonsucro calculator? Well, the good news is that the new version of the Bonsucro EU-RED Standard and the changes in relation to greenhouse gases in that standard have no consequences for the Bonsucro calculator. More in general terms, the current version of the Bonsucro calculator is version 5.2.3. Bonsucro is working on a new version of the standard, which will probably be published later this month. But as I said, there is no changes in that new version of the standard related to EU-RED. And calculator, as before, can still be used for the 4 different purposes mentioned here. So default values to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for ethanol, required greenhouse gas savings for ethanol, calculation of land use change emission using the land use change emission tool, and finally entering final results of actual greenhouse gas calculations. Then the subject of bagasse, and more specifically the non-modification requirements and auditing requirements for bagasse. Under the rules of the Renewable Energy Directive, the European Renewable Energy Directive, bagasse is considered a processing residue. And that is an advantage, because for processing residues, generally the sustainability requirements of the RED are pretty limited compared to the sustainability requirements that apply to agricultural feedstocks, such as sugarcane, or that apply to agricultural residues, such as agricultural residues from sugarcane production. The only sustainability requirements that apply to processing residues such as bagasse are the greenhouse gas requirements, the chain of custody requirements, and the non-modification requirement. And the non-modification requirement basically says that a material, a biomass stream, shall not intentionally be modified or discarded to classify as a residue. And this is, can you go back with the slide, please? This is because the non-modification requirement is here because it might be attractive for operators to classify other types of biomass as a processing residue, simply because in that case, there's only a few sustainability requirements that apply to that material. So it's relatively easy to certify that material. However, the non-modification requirement says you must prove that if you say that something is a processing residue, if you claim that something is bagasse, you shall basically prove that it is indeed that bagasse, that it is indeed a processing residue, and that it is not, for example, agricultural field residues, or that it is something else, some other type of biomass. Next slide, please. And then the question is, how can you prove that? How can a mill prove that it has not intentionally produced, let's say, more bagasse or claimed other biomass streams to be bagasse, while in fact that biomass is not bagasse? Well, for that purpose, indicator 8.1, which already existed in the previous version of the standard, has been amended. So basically, a mill must prove that the ratio between the quantity of cane it has processed and the quantity of bagasse which has been produced or which has been delivered or which has been which as a residue produced as a residue by the mill, that ratio is in an industry average range. And the industry average range, which has been set by Bonsucro in the standard, is 25 to 35%. So this means that normally you would expect that the quantity of bagasse in a mill as percentage of cane processed in that mill is somewhere in the order between 25 to 35%. If that figure is significantly higher, well, that can be because there is a deviation in the process, so that the mill is outside, let's say, the industry average. But it can also be the case that in that case a mill has intentionally added other material to the bagasse to qualify as a processing residue. So in other words, a mill has to prove to comply with these requirements that the industry average is that the ratio is between 25 or 35%, and if it's outside of that ratio, the mill has to explain why that is the case, why relatively more bagasse has been produced than you would expect. Next slide, please. Again, this is more or less in the same words. So the auditing of bagasse, specifically for this non-modification requirement, the EU-RED and therefore also the Bonsucro EU-RED standard would require an additional audit within 6 months of the first audit, specifically focusing on this non-modification requirement. But this is particularly relevant, of course, for auditors. Next slide, please. Again, this is more or less the same, where it also relates to the auditing of bagasse. Next slide, please. Yeah, then there is finally, I know most of you here in the webinar today probably won't be certification bodies and auditors, but still it's good to very briefly maybe highlight some of the changes in the requirements for audits and for certification bodies. There is two changes, or rather there's one change and one clarification. The first the change is about auditing of multi-site. Next slide, please. What is new is that section 6.9 of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard now includes detailed requirements for the auditing of both groups of farms and of multi-sites. And it specifies now that for the auditing of multi-sites, a similar approach must be followed for groups, which basically means that a four-step approach must be followed. First, risk factors must be determined on the basis of that risk factor. A minimum sample size shall be determined in step 2, and then based on the risk in step 3, a correction factor shall be applied. And in the fourth and last step, a selection of farms to be audited shall be made. This is very brief. This is a very extensive procedure, which, as I said, has been detailed in section 6.9 of the standard. So those of you who have interest in all the details, I highly recommend to read section 6.9. Then finally here, definition of a group manager. This is not a change in any way. This is not a change in requirements, because the role and the responsibilities of the group manager have not changed in the new version of the standard. What has changed is that a definition in section 2 on a definition of group manager has been included in section 2 of the standard, and you find that definition here. With that, I'm almost at the end of the presentation of the changes to the standard and the new version of the standard. However, this slide is still a very important one. It's about the implementation of the new version of the Bonsucro EU-RED standard. All Bonsucro EU-RED audits from 21st of May onwards shall be conducted against the new version 3 of the standard. However, any Bonsucro EU-RED certificates issued in compliance with EU-RED Standard 2.1, so the previous version of the standard, before 21st of May, these certificates, they will remain valid until the expiration date. In other words, it's not the case that all existing certificates against version 2.1 of the standard expire on the 21st of May. This is not the case. They will just remain valid until they expire. And of course, before they expire, sometime then later, a audit has to be done against version 3.0 of the standard. But it's not necessarily before the 21st of May. Also, and finally, all Bonsucro EU-RED certified volumes in stock, certified before the 21st of May, will be considered sustainable and as providing accurate information about greenhouse gas emissions under the EU-RED and more particularly the EU implementing regulation. Then finally, you might know in the Bonsucro EU-RED standard there is reference to a so-called low ILUC risk module. A module which has been developed by Bonsucro and which would allow certification of sugarcane against the EU requirements for low risk of indirect land use change of ILUC. That module has been developed by Bonsucro a while ago. It has been put to the European Commission for their assessment and their approval. However, this assessment has still not taken place, basically due to capacity constraints with the European Commission and their consultants, meaning that this low ILUC risk module, until further notice, is not available and unfortunately cannot be used. So Bonsucro has been chasing the European Commission to assess this and to approve this module. And we'll keep doing that, but it's uncertain when exactly this will be the case.